Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. We're excited to have you here with us this evening. And I just want to say thank you so much for all the new subscribers, for all your likes, your comments, and your shares. I read a lot of the comments, and I'm incredibly encouraged by everyone's knowledge and their passion and enthusiasm for the topics that matter to us the most. So, as you guys can see tonight, we're going to be talking about birthright citizenship and immigration. And did the Indian Wars really end? So, basically, this particular presentation is an update to the birthright citizenship presentation we did back on June 22nd, which was entitled "The 14th Amendment Was Meant for This." And we went into a lot of great, discussions about the post-war amendments in general. We talked about the 14th Amendment specifically. We even talked about the Wong Kim Ark Supreme Court case of 1898 and some really, amazing things to get us centered and focused on what the birthright citizenship debate is been about in relation to the indigenous peoples of the land and how it has changed so much. So if you have an opportunity, please go watch that video and also, be mindful that we are, we're building here. And I'm so grateful for everyone's patience as we build. And I know these presentations aren't even nearly long enough to cover everything, but I do a general dive so we have enough to work from. Also, the other video we did lately, the other day, was we talked about how the US government was built on indigenous law. Again, this is very connected to what our issues have been because when you talk about the US government and you talk about its laws and everything that's in place, again, most of that is built on the indigenous way of life. And I know a lot of people appreciated that video, and of course, there were some people who just thought we're talking woke nonsense. I even had somebody make a comment that said BS, BS, BS. And that's fine if people don't really believe us. That's totally fine. But I also go off not just the oral history, but I also look at the documentation and the paperwork and the receipts. And as you guys know, I'm going to bring the receipts because I don't like to argue with folks. I just like to show you. And for those who did not have an opportunity to see that video, in that video, we showed how in 1988, Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the development of the US Constitution. So there you have it there. And so but here, what I want to talk about is how things are connected, giving you guys an update on many things. I want to briefly talk about the Indian Wars. I want to go over the timeline on birthright citizenship because there have been a lot of developments there, particularly with the Department of Justice pretty much pushing the Supreme Court to make a decision on their executive order, or I should say, President Trump's executive order. And then I want to briefly talk about their Rule 11, which is standard whenever you're trying to get, um, you're trying to push some legalities here. And then we're going to talk about the Department of Justice's immigration initiatives in altogether, because when we talk about what's happening with birthright citizenship as well as with immigration, it's quite clear that there is a big push to make sure that the undocumented and those who have been causing incredible havoc on the land are removed. And it's very controversial for some people, but I also want to keep this rooted in law. I want to keep this rooted in, uh, how can I say this? I don't want to say that it's an unemotional argument, but I definitely don't want us to get so caught up in the emotions that we forget about the law. and we forget about what we're supposed to do here in relation to our ancestral obligations, as well as how to live in peace and harmony. And part of living in peace and harmony is having structure. So, but with any case, I'm going to dive into briefly the Indian wars that were fought, at least on record, from 1609 to 1890. Now, the reason why I bring the Indian wars up is because we're still fighting about the same things that we were fighting about 200 years ago, or 2 centuries ago, I should say, when the Indian wars were recorded. Now, we've always talked about the Indian wars in three ways: the land, who controls it; law, whose jurisdiction applies; and belonging, who belongs under that law. And uh, guaranteed, when you look at a lot of the cases, the legal cases that have been coming down, you can pretty much put them in various buckets. And these buckets are going to fall under these 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 areas here: land, law, and belonging, particularly as it relates to the indigenous peoples, or as we would say, the quote unquote African American. But particularly then, we were primarily looking at land and jurisdiction. Those were the two biggest impositions on our indigenous nations more than anything. And when you look at the Indian wars individually, it's like you're looking at a mini series. I mean, there's so many wars fought, and and then of course we were fighting against each other as well. Now, what we discovered and what we can analyze a bit more deeply is that there were various tools to remove us. And it was a very focused, concentrated effort. And yes, it started with the treaties. Once we quote unquote put our arms down, then we said, okay, well, we'll come up with some agreements as to how we're going to operate together. So those treaties led to removals, because if you guys really study those treaties, most of those treaties were never honored. I would say about 95% of them were not honored. So those treaties led to our removal, they led to assimilation policies, and they led to reclassification, meaning we went from Indian to color to Negro to African American. So there was a very focused and methodical way of methods they use to just completely put us in a whole different bag, right? And through that, we've had to constantly fight for our own sovereignty, if you will, our individual sovereignty, as well as that of our nation, which we've been separated from, to be quite frank. And now, like then, we had to have consent to enter the nation, duties and obligations to stay, and sanctions for violators. That was Indigenous. So I covered that a lot in the Indigenous law video. But we're still dealing with that now. Regulated membership. We're now being asked to, or I should say, we're asking permission to be a member of tribes and nations that we technically were already members of anyway. But don't get me started. I can go down a whole rabbit hole here, but I won't. I just want to keep it focused. And I sometimes I get emotional when I talk about these things. But as you guys know, and I'll do a video on this too, the Creeks were, or the Creek freedmen. I don't even like saying freedmen, but for the record, the Creek freedmen were granted citizenship through the Creek Nation. So, yeah, we'll talk about that later. But again, like I said, when you see all of these things, we were fighting for land, jurisdiction, and membership, just like then we're fighting for it now. And as we talk about birthright citizenship in particular, even though that might not be a direct fight for us right now because we are quote unquote US citizens, it's still something that we're looking at from the sidelines and saying, "Wow, it's amazing how the 14th Amendment has now been kind of twisted to be something else." And yes, you could say it's a misinterpretation of the law, or you can say that's not what they meant, but that that's going to come down the pipe pretty soon here. We're going to talk about that. So, birthright citizenship, I want to give you guys a timeline as to what's been happening because it's a lot. And some of it, I want, at least for the record, I want you guys to see the order of things because it's really, really important that we understand what's been happening legally. And I'll go through this pretty quickly. As you guys know, President Trump signed Executive Order 14160 on January 20th. Then in late January, civil rights groups and affected families of that order filed lawsuits in Seattle Federal District Court challenging the executive order as being unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. So that's where everything started. And the Trump administration knew that it was going to happen. They know that everything that they've been putting out there in terms of executive orders and what have you will be challenged legally. And that's part of the strategy is to challenge the existing law or challenge the existing interpretation of law. So that's what has happened in the past, and that's what the Trump administration is doing now. So in early February, after the lawsuit was filed, federal judge in Seattle issued a nationwide preliminary injunction blocking the executive order. So that is where things got really heady because what happened after that, the DOJ appealed and appealed that particular injunction. So that's how it ended up at the Supreme Court. And in mid-March, Supreme Court basically issued a separate procedural decision in an unrelated case, limiting when lower courts can issue nationwide injunctions without appellate review. So all of that just changed a lot of things. And when they came down with the decision back in June, it was basically Supreme Court said, look, we're going on record. No more lower courts can issue nationwide injunctions. So it went through a very, lengthy process over those course of those few weeks, and it became formalized back in June. Yeah, I'm making sure I get my dates right here. And then in late July, the Ninth Circuit upheld the Seattle judge's injunction, keeping the executive order blocked nationwide during the appeal. So again, when the Supreme Court made that ruling, the ruling did not cancel injunctions that were already uh, reviewed and being upheld by the appeals courts. So I can go into a whole lot of legalese and step by steps, but I just wanted to summarize it so that you guys understood what was happening here and how things have been moving down the pipeline. Because this is how the law often works: is that you just got to go through the process. So now, recently, August 7th, is a few days ago, the DOJ tells the Seattle judge it plans to ask the Supreme Court for an expedited review of the case, seeking a ruling on the constitutionality of the executive order. And this is where things are going to get pretty heated because the the Supreme Court, when they basically told lower courts that they couldn't issue nationwide injunctions, that didn't necessarily mean that they had made a decision on the executive order. So now the DOJ is saying, yes, please, can you just go ahead and make a decision on the executive order so that we can keep it moving? Now, what's going to be really interesting here is that the Supreme Court is going to be asked to do an immediate review. And the DOJ is asking for that immediate review and skipping the normal process because they're citing imperative public importance. And it really is. Because right now, with that executive order kind of hanging in the air, there's this feeling that if we don't make a decision, we're going to have more legal issues down the road. And it's not really going to stop. um, because we need to make a decision either way. So the Supreme Court has to decide in the next few days and weeks whether to take the case, whether they're going to say, yeah, we'll look at that, and then whether to keep the injunction in place while reviewing as well. And then, if they take the case, whether to uphold or overturn Wong Kim Ark precedent on birthright citizenship. So it's a big, big, big deal. They also do have another case that's going through the pipeline. It's called Barbara versus Trump. So that would probably be a secondary issue if the Supreme Court doesn't, basically look at the DOJ's request. But I don't want to talk about Barbara versus Trump. Yeah, that's a whole nother legal case. But I just want to focus on this right now. So, to get you guys up to speed as to what Rule 11 is, there's an ordinary track and an expedited track. Now, the typical timing for a Rule 11 petition is normally 2 to 6 months just to decide whether to hear the case. And then the arguments would be heard in the early 2026 term, right? So, but if you expedite it, there's an emergency stay decision in 7 to 14 days from filing. And the full grant of Rule 11 could be within 1 to 2 months from the filing. But that's just typical conjecture. I don't really know. But the biggest thing is to wait for the Supreme Court to say whether they will hear the case or not. That's big. So people are still going to be hanging in the balance here for the next couple of months at least, just for the Supreme Court to decide. But if they expedite it, it could be a matter of days. It could be the next 2 weeks to a month, maybe. So we'll see how that goes. But um, I definitely would be waiting for those Supreme Court alerts because it's going to be big if they decide they want to hear the case. It's going to be huge. So, to give you guys a little history as to what the Supreme Court has done in cases like this before, for instance, in the United States versus Nixon, the Supreme Court agreed to take the case 16 days after the petition was filed. And as you guys know, Nixon this was part of the Watergate scandal. And they had to hurry up and figure out what they were going to do with this president who was trying to influence the election. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? And I'm not trying to laugh, but I just think of the irony of what we're dealing with now, and we're still dealing with these same issues. And as you guys know, for those of you who were born around that time or lived around that time, Nixon was removed from office and Gerald Ford became the president. But, Watergate is huge. This is very, very historical if you guys aren't really familiar with that. And so you can go look that up. And I'll have links to that as well in the description. The other case that the Supreme Court granted a review of the next day because of the election timeline was Bush versus Gore in the 2000 election, when Gore had basically said there were some election anomalies in the Florida handling of ballots. So, but in the end, Bush basically won that, and there you have it again. That was incredibly historic as well. It's funny because I've lived through all these times. I mean, I was a child during Nixon, so I don't really remember all of that. But uh, these are some historical cases and moments in history, you guys. And I know for many people, they are quite aware of the drama around these two particular cases. Now, I want to also talk about the DOJ's immigration initiatives because this is, I just want to say, birthright citizenship is just one issue that the administration is tackling here. I want to let you guys know that they are incredibly, I want to say, obsessed with making sure that this nation is not filled with a lot of undocumented people, and they're trying really, really hard to reverse the former administration's policies regarding immigration and or the lack of enforcement of the undocumented. But I just want to say that, you know, if you do your reading and your kind of analysis of this, you know that Biden and Kamala Harris had tried to fix things, but they tried it a little too late. And that is why we're here. Yes, many people flooded the borders and then they tried to reverse it, but at that point it was too late. It was too late. You know, once you open up the gate and you realize what you did, like, oh, I should have closed that gate. It's too late. You know, you already opened it. So in any case, the biggest thing that the Department of Justice is going for the jugular on is sanctuary cities. And you guys have heard this a lot. And I'm just showing you a map, and this is probably not even the latest map, but this is the Department of Justice is making sure that sanctuary cities and counties and states comply with their federal mandates to remove the undocumented. And the sanctuary cities and their policies are not are not in alignment, I will say, with the feds. So the DOJ is, as in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security, is really putting the boot on the neck of these cities so that they'll comply. And it's been a battle, as you guys know, but this is just one of the initiatives that they're focusing on is really putting the sanctuary cities to a legal task. And it's getting heated everywhere. As you can see, the sanctuary cities are in some key areas. And if you guys look at this map, the sanctuary cities are all in prime real estate. Isn't that something? So, what we see sometimes is not, we see things on the surface, but there's so much more that's underneath that. So, I look at all this and I look at the map and I said, huh, these are all coastal cities. Isn't that something? So the other thing that the DOJ is focusing on is denaturalization. So the DOJ wrote a memo that directed attorneys to prioritize and maximally pursue civil denaturalization under their code with categories national security slash terrorism, human rights violators, major fraud slash organized crime. Now, this is huge, and you guys have probably already seen some cases that have popped up in the news about people being denaturalized, and they're going for this. So that means there are a lot of people who are going to be they're going to just be denaturalized on paper. That's it. There's just going to be so many people that are going to be receiving a notification, a lawsuit, what have you, from the Department of Justice telling them, "Yo, look, you're being denaturalized. You can show up to court, um, present yourself, boom, boom, boom." And there's that's a whole um, video in itself, but that is one of the biggest. Um, I don't want to say the biggest, but it's one of the most significant initiatives that the DOJ is focused on because, as you can see here, you can be naturalized and it can be taken away from you just like that. And that's why being a US citizen, if you go through that process for naturalization, you have to be darn near perfect. You cannot break any rule, and your US citizenship as a naturalized citizen is dependent on your behavior, clearly. The other initiative is criminal prosecutions. The DOJ is basically spiking all of these criminal prosecutions as it relates to reentry charges in particular. Um, and if you go to the Department of Justice, you'll see all these press releases that show a steady case filings. Go there, you'll see it. They're going for it here. They're not playing around with people at all, at all. They also are, imposing civil fines on people. The DHS and DOJ issued an interim final rule that centralizes how Department of Homeland Security issues civil monetary penalties for things like A, failing to depart after a removal order, and B, being caught improperly entering the US. And so historically, you are fined up to $500 a day. Now, sometimes in some cities, sometimes the amount is up to $1,000 a day. And I don't know if you guys saw that one story. That lady said she got a notification that she owed the government $1.8 million. $1.8 million. Now it's deep because they say, you know what, we might not be able to put you in jail, but we can make sure that you never come back here. And these fines are real. They're not playing. They're not doing this for dramatic effect. You really will be fined for not leaving the US. That's why when they offer you $1,000 and a plane ticket, some people should probably take that, because what's going to happen is the fact that they have you registered in the system means that you're already accumulating a debt that you might not be able to pay back. And that means if you can't pay it back, then you probably won't be able to re-enter the country. So I'm just showing you guys all of the immigration initiatives, and these are just some. I mean, there are about three or four other ones I didn't even add to this. They are they're going hard on this immigration. It's no joke. So I just wanted to share that with you guys and give you an update as to what's been happening with Birthright Citizenship. I'll continue to keep you guys posted. There's so much going on. And I was in the middle of working on the redistricting video, because that's getting heated too. That's that's definitely a big case, a big story. But I'll be working on that in the next week here. So if you guys have any comments, I love to hear them. I love to hear what you guys have to say. You guys always give me ideas as well, and keep them coming. And I appreciate all the shares. It's just feels really good to see such a community and to see us talking about all of these things in real time. We also want to encourage you guys to go to the Hidden Histories Collective website, sign up, and we will be talking to you guys that way as well. So have an amazing evening, and we will be talking to you guys soon. Good night.